Kein Anschluss unter dieser Nummer.
Part of my job in the city's Metropolitan Police Department involves organising and maintaining inventory of our evidence lockers. Most of the work is mindless counting and weighing of objects with a hefty side of data entry. It's primarily drugs, documents and confiscated weapons. However, I would like to share with you some of the more disturbing objects that are kept in Evidence Locker 13. Evidence Locker 13 is a place for particularly gruesome objects taken from crime scenes throughout the state. Often, these are homemade devices and improvised weaponry, objects you want to isolate due to their volatile nature. Some of this stuff you just don't want to lump in with the run-of-your-mill handguns and knives. This collection of brutal and twisted inventions has come to be affectionately referred to as the Maniacs Museum. And before anyone asks, photographs are prohibited in evidence lockers without special consent, so no, I will not be providing pictures. I can only describe to you some of the things I've seen. Object 316, the Rostington family mace. In 1988, Alfred Rostington, son of farm owner Gabriel Rostington, was murdered in cold blood by the teenage sons of the neighbouring Anderson family. Alfred Rostington, at the time of his death, was only 16 years old. His murder resulted from a feud between Alfred and the two Anderson boys. Gabriel Rostington discovered his son's body on the Andersons' property, but though the enmity between the boys was well known, his lawyer could not show sufficient evidence to produce a conviction. 1 week after the trial, the entire Anderson family was found brutally killed in their home. Gabriel Rostington happily pleaded guilty to the atrocity but refused to surrender the murder weapon. After an exhaustive search, police uncovered the grisly weapon buried in the woods adjacent to the Rostingtons' farm. Alfred Rostington's femur bone and skull were riveted together. Leather straps were wrapped around the base of the femur to create a handle, while the inner cavities of the skull were filled in with cement. 9 carpenter's nails measuring 7 inches in length protruded outwards from the skull. The coroner's report confirmed that injuries present on the Anderson family's bodies were likely the result of this improvised mace. Object 134, the Cold Stone. A unique name, I know. The Cold Stone is a curious object that is yet to be fully identified. Spoiler alert, it's cold. I mean, ice cold, freaking freezing. I was allowed to touch it only briefly once, and only with protection of gloves. Under normal circumstances, the Cold Stone is handled with metal tongs. So other than its temperature, what's the big deal, right? Well, the Cold Stone wasn't even discovered in the metropolitan area, but custody of it was transferred to our department because the local authorities just didn't know what to do with it. It was found in a cornfield at the bottom of a crater. The dimensions of the crater were recorded to be 16 feet in diameter and 4.5 feet deep. There were no witnesses to its impact, and it is uncertain how long the crater had even been there before it was discovered. The peculiar part of the Cold Stone is the effects it had on local animal life. As I said, this object was found on farmland, and so the reported cases involved were in relation to injuries sustained by farm animals. Farmers began to notice their cattle and horses experiencing a difficulty in walking and general symptoms of discomfort. This continued for some time before the animals displayed waxy, discoloured flesh around their hooves. Many of the animals refused to stand. 16 cases of gangrene were recorded. Once authorities became involved, a veterinarian was called in to find the cause of these symptoms. His conclusion was that these animals were suffering from immersion foot, or, as historians may more commonly recognise it, trench foot. Authorities were baffled by the revelation that farm animals were afflicted by a World War I era injury, and at first, no connection was made between the outbreak and the Cold Stone. There's no outlying fluctuations of ground temperature in the area, no reported cases affecting humans. So, symptoms of trench foot, though, they quickly vanished when the Cold Stone was removed from the area, and further investigations were ceased. Many surmise that the Cold Stone is an extraterrestrial object due to the impact crater in which it was found. It is also composed of a yet unknown material, and the source of its extremely low temperature cannot be identified. The reason the cold stone is kept in the Maniacs Museum is the fact that it is clearly man-made. It is less of a stone than the name would suggest, and instead resembles a smooth sphere around the size of a kiwi. Currently, this object is classified as a chemical weapon. Object 160, the Devil's Piano. The Devil's Piano is a true instrument of torture. It was used in only one instance by the electrician who designed it. To understand the workings of the Devil's Piano, one should be familiar with the manner in which pianos produce music. When a key on a standard piano is depressed, it releases a hammer inside the instrument which strikes against a highly taut wire. The resulting vibration produces a note, dependent upon the thickness and hardness of that wire, blah blah blah. The strings inside the Devil's Piano are connected to a power source and extend out of the rear of the instrument. There are 88 wires in total. In the case of the Devil's Piano, these 88 wires were connected to electrodes, which are inserted into the victim's muscles with the lunar needles. Now, these wires are not complete electrical circuits, however. To complete the circuit, the wires must make contact with their corresponding hammer, which has been rigged with a second conducting wire. When a key is pressed, the hammer strikes the cord to temporarily close the circuit and jolts the victim with an electrical pulse. Each key of the piano produces a different level of voltage. Keys at the lower end of the scale produce low voltage shocks. Higher notes produce greater voltage. The electrical output of the 88 wires is not substantial enough to outright kill a fully grown adult. However, as the Devil's Piano is played, the victim at the rear of the instrument is subjected to a series of shocks, varying in their voltage with each note. In the single case that the Devil's Piano was used, its creator subjected his wife to tormenting this vile creation. Reports indicate that the song chosen by the electrician was an instrumental rendition of Rezzo Suarez's Gloomy Sunday. Object 200, the Smiling Chamber. An unlucky trio of cavers discovered the Smiling Chamber. In order to reach the section of cavern in question, one must first traverse a rock tunnel nearly 200 yards long. In several places, this tunnel diminishes in height to a couple of feet, meaning one can only access the Smiling Chamber by crawling on their stomach. I have not had the misfortune of entering this cave myself, but numerous photographs of this haunting cathedral are housed in the Maniacs Museum. The chamber itself is a large opening that dead-ends Loon Hill Cave. The domed ceiling was measured 25 feet, and the chamber is roughly 18 feet across in any given direction. Cubby holes have been carved into the walls of the chamber on all sides with a chisel and hammer, testifying to the sheer amount of labour hours that the Smiling Chamber's creator devoted to his hobby. The total number of these cubby holes is 24. Upon discovery, each of these nooks had on display a severed human head, pickled in a cocktail of formalin and alcohol. The Smiling Chamber, though, received its nickname due to this collection of craniums and the terrifying grins forced upon their faces. Aluminum pins were used to stretch the corners of the victim's lips into a wide smile before the pins were pushed into the gum line. In a few instances, the tongues of the victims were made to hang out of the mouth and similarly pinned to the chin or cheeks. The majority of the victims had both eyelids sewn open, while a handful were elected to have one eye sewn shut in a grim wink. A crank-operated generator was used to power utility lights, which illuminated the walls of the Smiling Chamber. All of the head's previous owners have been identified. The sadist behind this handiwork has not. Object 202, the Dead Man's Cradle. Like many of the larger contraptions in the Maniacs Museum, the Dead Man's Cradle is not kept in its original form, but photographs accompany their confiscated components. The Dead Man's Cradle was a torture and murder device discovered in an abandoned warehouse somewhere in the city's industrial district. The dead man's cradle was a loosely wound cocoon of razor wire and barbed wire, similar in construction to a hammock, with tangled strands of wire woven together in a 7-foot-long net structure. The net was woven in such a way that all of these cords of wire met at the foot and head of the cradle. Victims were laid atop the hammock and would experience the excruciating pain of their own body weight bearing down on the sharp wires and vicious barbs. Nonetheless, this was not the conclusion of the cradle's macabre purpose. Through a feat of misanthropic engineering, the cords at each end of the cradle were twisted into knotted cables which were fed into a pair of electric winches, similar to those used by tow trucks. When these winches drew in the cables, the edges of the cradle were drawn up and around the victim, enclosing him on all sides in an encasement of gnarly wires. As the winches drew tighter, the cradle tightened around its victim, squeezing, slicing deeper into them. There are 3 confirmed victims in the dead man's cradle. The final victim's body was found shredded, their flesh dangling down like ribbons from the cradle and their suspended skeleton broken in several places due to constriction. Object 293. Mr. LaJoy's carousel. Dazzling lights flashing off silver mirrors, whimsical music swirling overhead, gentle hydraulics lifting you up and down as you spin round and round. What kid doesn't love a carousel? Algernon LaJoy's carousel, however, was not quite so fanciful. Algernon LaJoy was a mechanical engineer that designed various rides and attractions for state fairs. In his free time, he was a homicidal psychopath. His own self-proclaimed magnum opus was the gold crimson carousel discovered in his warehouse. Riders are not sat atop lions or tigers or bears, oh my no, but were instead designed to be seated atop one of a dozen human beings suspended, as if crawling on their hands and knees around the carousel. Over 5 years, Mr. LaJoy abducted 6 men and 6 women of varying races and backgrounds. Upon their capture, a gold-plated pole was impaled between their shoulder blades. Victims were left to bleed out and, upon their death, were posed like frolicking animals 1 quarter ways up the pole. A thick lacquer was applied to every inch of their bodies. Upon hardening, the lacquer was sealed as to preserve the corpses inside, and then painted with bright pastels and neon. The whole process took about 2 weeks, and at its conclusion a leather saddle was bolted to the coccyx and thoracic vertebrae of the human mannequin. Each completed pole was then mounted into a hydraulic lift on the ride. Perhaps the most perturbing aspect of Mr. LaJoy's story occurred on May 22nd, 1993, when local children were invited into the property of LaJoy's Funtime Engineering and allowed to ride the carousel. Authorities responded when parents grew wary of the uncanny and disturbing appearance of the ride.